What if the person searching for your heart was standing right in front of you, and you had no idea? What if every conversation that made your soul come alive, every stolen glance that sent electricity through your veins, every moment of perfect understanding was built on a secret that could either destroy everything or make it infinitely more beautiful? Nadia Church never imagined that helping a quiet stranger find a rare book would lead to the most passionate love story of her life. She couldn't have known that the man whose thoughtful questions about literature kept her awake at night, whose gentle voice made her hands tremble as she poured his coffee, was actually the celebrated author whose words had been quietly shaping her heart for years. Picture this: October rain hammering against the tall windows of Church books like nature's own percussion symphony, each drop catching the golden light from vintage table lamps that had welcomed book lovers for 3 generations. The autumn storm rolled through the small town of Millbrook with the kind of intensity that made people grateful for warm, safe spaces. Inside the bookstore, time seemed to move differently, as if the walls themselves understood that some moments were too precious to rush. Nadia moved through her literary sanctuary like a guardian angel, her flowing burgundy dress catching the amber glow as she arranged books by candlelight, the power flickering with each crack of thunder. The scent of aged paper mingled with vanilla from the small candles she'd lit throughout the store, creating an atmosphere so intoxicating it seemed to pulse with possibility. Her natural hair, adorned with a vintage silk scarf the color of autumn leaves, caught the warm light as she reached for a leather-bound volume on the poetry shelf, completely absorbed in her evening ritual. That's when he appeared. Taylor Grayson stood silhouetted in her doorway, rain dripping from his dark wool coat, his blue-green eyes reflecting the candle's flame as they found hers across the sea of books. For a heartbeat that felt suspended in eternity, neither moved. The storm raged behind him, but something in the air between them crackled with an entirely different kind of electricity, the kind that changes everything in an instant. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice carrying just the slightest roughness from the cold rain. "I saw your light and thought you might still be open. I can come back tomorrow if—" "No, please." The words escaped Nadia's lips before she could stop them, surprising them both with their breathless quality. "Come in out of the storm." As Taylor stepped inside and closed the door against the wild weather, Church books seemed to exhale, wrapping them both in its quiet magic. Water dripped from his coat onto the worn wooden floors that had welcomed seekers and dreamers for 67 years, and Nadia found herself mesmerized by the way he moved, careful and deliberate, as if he instinctively understood the sacred nature of the space he'd entered. "I've never seen anything quite like this place," Taylor said softly, his gaze traveling over the floor-to-ceiling shelves, the cozy reading nooks with their jewel-toned armchairs, the rolling ladder that provided access to literary treasures near the coffered ceiling. "It feels like stepping into a love letter to stories themselves." Something in his voice, wonder mixed with a deeper recognition, made Nadia's heart flutter in a way she hadn't experienced in years. There was something familiar about this stranger, something that whispered of destiny and dangerous possibilities. Have you ever felt an instant connection with a stranger, as if your souls recognized each other before your minds caught up? As if the universe had been conspiring to bring you together in that exact moment, when all your defenses were down and your heart was wide open to the impossible? If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our Dear Love Diaries family. Your special place in this community of heartfelt stories is waiting for you. These passionate journeys of souls connecting against all odds have brought together thousands of beautiful hearts just like yours. Make sure you hit the bell too, so you'll know immediately when a new story unfolds in our diary of love. Chapter 2. But let me take you back to understand what led to that extraordinary storm night encounter, to show you the woman whose heart was ready for love even though her mind was focused on survival, and the man whose journey would bring him to her doorstep at exactly the moment when both their souls needed saving. 3 weeks before that life-changing October evening, Nadia Church awakened each morning to the familiar weight of legacy pressing gently against her chest like a silk ribbon, beautiful but binding. Her apartment above Church books caught the first rays of autumn sunlight through lace curtains that had belonged to her grandmother, the woman who'd first dreamed of creating a sanctuary for book lovers in this small town. The coffee maker gurgled to life automatically, filling the space with rich aroma that would soon mingle with the beloved scent of aged paper and leather bindings below. At 28, Nadia possessed the kind of natural grace that made even the simplest movements look intentional and beautiful. Her dark skin seemed to glow in the morning light filtering through those ancestral curtains, and her eyes, large and expressive, with flecks of gold that appeared when she discussed something that stirred her passion, held both profound strength and carefully guarded vulnerability. She wrapped herself in a silk robe the color of deep wine, her natural hair falling in loose coils around her shoulders, and padded barefoot to the window overlooking Main Street. Below, the town of Millbrook was painting itself in the warm colors of October. Mrs. Chen arranged chrysanthemums outside her flower shop, their bronze and gold petals creating splashes of autumn joy against weathered brick buildings. The coffee shop across the street already showed signs of its morning rush, steam rising from customers' mugs as they hurried to work. And there, nestled between the vintage clothing boutique and the small art gallery that featured local painters, sat Church Books, her pride, her burden, her everything. The sight of her family's bookstore always created a complex symphony of emotions in Nadia's chest. Love, certainly, deep and abiding as the roots of the old oak tree that had shaded the front entrance for longer than anyone could remember. Pride in what 3 generations of church women had built, a place where literature lived and breathed, where lonely souls found companionship in stories, where the magic of words transformed ordinary days into extraordinary adventures. But lately, worry had been the strongest note in that emotional symphony. The stack of unpaid bills on her kitchen table seemed to grow thicker each month, despite her careful budgeting and the 70-hour weeks she worked. Online retailers were making it increasingly difficult for independent bookstores to compete. The younger generation appeared more interested in screens than pages, more drawn to instant gratification than the slow burn of a beautifully crafted sentence. And most terrifying of all, she'd been having the horrible thought that maybe she would be the church woman who let it all slip away. "Nadia Marie, you're thinking too hard again," came a familiar voice from the hallway. Professor Theodore Church, her 72-year-old father, appeared in her doorway carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee and wearing the concerned expression that had been her anchor through every storm of her life. His salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed, his cardigan the soft brown of aged leather, and his dark eyes, so much like her own, held the wisdom that came from spending 5 decades teaching young minds to fall in love with literature. "Good morning, Daddy," Nadia smiled, accepting the coffee gratefully. Theodore had moved into the apartment next door after her mother's sudden death 2 years ago, claiming he wanted to help with the bookstore, but they both knew he'd stayed to catch her if she fell. "That crease between your eyebrows tells me you're worrying about things beyond your control again," he said, settling into the overstuffed chair by her window. "Your mother used to get that same expression when she was trying to solve the world's problems before breakfast." Eleanor Church had been gone for 2 years now, but her presence still filled every corner of the bookstore below. She'd built the rare books collection that was now their most valuable asset, and potentially their salvation. Mrs. Charlotte O'Neill, a wealthy collector from the next town over, had been calling weekly about purchasing the entire collection. The offer would cover 6 months of expenses, but it would also mean dismantling the heart of what made church books special. Charlotte called again last night, Nadia admitted, watching steam rise from her coffee mug. Her offer increased by 20%. Professor Theodore's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And what did you tell her?" "That I needed time to think." Nadia's voice was barely above a whisper. "Daddy, what if I'm being selfish? What if holding on to Mama's collection is just pride, and I should take the money and try to build something sustainable?" "Your mother didn't collect those books for their monetary value," Theodore said firmly. "She collected them because she believed rare books should be accessible to people who love them, not locked away in private collections. Every first edition downstairs has found its way to someone who needed that exact story at that exact moment in their life." Downstairs, the ritual of opening church books each morning remained sacred to Nadia. She unlocked the heavy wooden door that her grandfather had carved with intricate vines and flowers, breathing in the familiar perfume of aged paper, leather bindings, and the lavender sachets her mother had hidden throughout the stacks. Morning light filtered through tall windows, illuminating dancing dust particles that seemed to celebrate being awakened. She moved through the space like a priestess performing ancient rites, adjusting displays, watering the plants that thrived in the reading nooks, starting the small coffee station that had become surprisingly popular with customers who wanted to browse while they caffeinated. "Morning, Miss Church." Danny Johnson burst through the front door at exactly 8:30, as he had every morning for the past year. At 20, Danny was all enthusiasm and sharp angles, tall and lanky with an infectious grin and the kind of genuine love for literature that reminded Nadia why she'd chosen this life. He was working his way through his English literature degree at the local college, and his part-time job at Church Books felt more like a calling than employment. "Tell me you remembered to eat actual food this morning," Nadia said, hanging her vintage leather jacket behind the counter. "Because I brought banana bread from Hartwell's bakery, and I'm not above mothering you if necessary." Danny laughed, the sound brightening the entire store. "I had coffee." "That's technically food in several cultures." "It's technically dehydration and poor decision-making," Nadia retorted, pulling warm slices from a paper bag. "Sit. Eat. Tell me what impossible literary quest some customer is going to send us on today." This was what Nadia treasured most about working with Danny, his infectious excitement about every literary challenge, every customer's story, every rare find. They settled at the small table near the front window, sharing breakfast while watching the world wake up outside. The days leading up to that storm had been particularly challenging. Foot traffic was down, sales were slow, and Nadia found herself staying later each evening, trying to find some solution she'd missed, some angle that might save the store without sacrificing its soul. She'd taken to working by lamplight in the rare books section, surrounded by her mother's carefully curated collection, hoping that somehow being close to those treasured volumes would inspire an answer. Her regular customers had become more precious than ever. Mrs. Patterson, who came in every Tuesday for the latest mystery novels and always had a story about her grandchildren. Mr. Hendricks, a retired teacher who spent his afternoons in the philosophy section, occasionally engaging Nadia in discussions that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with literature in the first place. Lila Kent, the local artist who painted portraits and had an uncanny ability to see into people's souls, always encouraging Nadia to remain hopeful about love and life. "You're too young to give up on magic," Lila had said just the week before, her artist's eye noting the weariness Nadia tried to hide. "Sometimes the most beautiful things come into our lives when we're least prepared for them." Nadia had smiled politely, but privately wondered if she'd used up all her magic on keeping the bookstore alive. At 28, she felt ancient when it came to matters of the heart. Her last relationship, with David, a banker who'd ultimately left her for someone more ambitious, had ended 18 months ago with the devastating observation that maybe she was too attached to the past to build a future. Meanwhile, in New York City, Taylor Grayson was facing his own crisis of the heart and soul. The 35-year-old literary sensation had retreated to his high-rise apartment after another suffocating publishing event, staring out at the city lights and feeling more isolated than ever. His latest novel had been another critical and commercial success, but the words felt hollow, disconnected from the authentic voice that had made his debut so powerful. "You need to get back to your roots," his therapist had suggested. "Find the place that first inspired you to write." Taylor had grown up 2 hours north of Millbrook, in a town so similar it could have been the setting for his first novel. He'd been driving aimlessly through small towns for weeks, trying to reconnect with something real, something that wasn't tainted by fame and expectations. The name, Church Books, on the vintage sign had caught his attention because it reminded him of the small bookstore where he'd spent countless childhood hours, dreaming of becoming a writer. He'd planned to just drive past, but something about the warm light glowing through the windows on that storm-dark evening had called to him like a beacon. Maybe it was the way the golden illumination seemed to promise sanctuary from more than just the weather. Maybe it was the recognition that he was desperately searching for something authentic, something real, something that could remind him why he'd fallen in love with words in the first place. As Taylor stood in his rented car outside Church Books that October evening, rain beginning to fall in earnest, he had no idea that the woman inside was conducting her own desperate search for salvation. He couldn't have known that Nadia Church was exactly the kind of person his heart had been seeking, someone who understood that books were living things, that stories could heal wounds, that literature was a sacred trust between writer and reader. All he knew was that the light in her windows felt like home, and he'd been homesick for longer than he could remember. What's the most magical bookstore or library you've ever discovered? Share in the comments. I read every single one and love hearing about the places that made your heart sing with possibility. When Taylor finally stepped out of his car and walked toward that glowing sanctuary, when the storm drove him to seek shelter in Church Books, neither he nor Nadia could have imagined that they were about to begin the most transformative chapter of both their lives. Sometimes the most profound love stories begin not with grand gestures, but with simple human need, the need for shelter, for connection, for someone who understands that words have the power to change everything. Chapter 3. The morning after the storm, Nadia awakened with a strange lightness in her chest, as if something fundamental had shifted in the universe overnight. Sunlight streamed through her lace curtains with unusual brilliance, and even the familiar weight of unpaid bills seemed somehow more manageable. She found herself humming as she dressed, choosing a flowing skirt the color of autumn leaves and a cream sweater that brought out the warmth in her skin, though she couldn't quite explain why she was taking extra care with her appearance. "You're glowing this morning," Professor Theodore observed over coffee, his perceptive eyes noting the change in his daughter's demeanor. "Did something happen last night after I went to bed?" "Just a customer seeking shelter from the storm," Nadia replied, but even she could hear the smile in her voice. "Nothing extraordinary." Theodore raised an eyebrow but said nothing, filing away this information with the instinctive protectiveness of a father who'd watched his daughter rebuild herself after heartbreak. Downstairs, Church Books felt different somehow, as if the very air held new possibilities. Nadia found herself glancing toward the front window more often than usual, though she told herself she was simply checking the weather. When 3 o'clock arrived, the precise time Taylor had mentioned he might return, her pulse quickened with an anticipation she hadn't felt in years. The bell above the door chimed exactly at 3:15, and there he was. Taylor stepped inside carrying the scent of autumn air and something else, cedar, perhaps, or sandalwood, that made Nadia's breath catch. In daylight, without the drama of the storm, she could see him more clearly, the way his dark hair caught the afternoon light, the intensity of those blue-green eyes, the careful way he moved through her space as if he understood its sacred nature. "I wanted to thank you again for last night," he said, approaching the counter where Nadia was cataloging new arrivals. "Not everyone would have welcomed a stranger during a storm." "Church Books has always been a sanctuary," Nadia replied, noticing how his presence seemed to make the entire store feel more alive. "Besides, you didn't feel like a stranger." The admission surprised them both, hanging in the air between them like a confession neither had planned to make. "I was hoping," Taylor continued, his voice carrying a slight roughness that made Nadia's skin warm, "that you might help me with something specific. I'm searching for a particular book, and I have a feeling if anyone can find it, it would be you." "What kind of book?" Nadia asked, leaning forward slightly, drawn by the careful way he was choosing his words. "A first edition of Echoes of Small Towns by Taylor Grayson," he said, and Nadia noticed how he seemed to hold his breath after speaking the title, as if her reaction mattered more than it should to a simple book request. Nadia's eyes lit up with genuine excitement. "Oh, that's one of the most beautiful debut novels I've read in years," she exclaimed, completely missing the way Taylor's expression shifted at her enthusiasm. "The way Grayson captures the heartbeat of small-town life, the dreams that feel too big for the places that shape us, it's extraordinary. The prose has this luminous quality, like he's painting with words instead of just telling a story." Taylor stared at her for a moment, something vulnerable flickering across his features. "You've read it?" "Multiple times," Nadia confessed, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. I keep a reading copy here in the store because I love recommending it to customers who are searching for something real. Something that reminds them why literature matters. She paused, studying his face. What draws you to that particular book? It reminds me of home, Taylor said simply, but Nadia heard layers of meaning in those 4 words, depths she found herself wanting to explore. I don't have a first edition in stock, she continued, but I'd love to help you find one. It might take some time. That book has developed quite a following, and first editions are becoming increasingly rare. But I have connections with estate sales, private collectors, other bookstores. She trailed off, realizing she was rambling, caught up in the thrill of a literary quest and the way Taylor was listening to every word as if it mattered. Time isn't a problem, Taylor said, his eyes never leaving her face. I'm not going anywhere. Something in the way he said it made Nadia's pulse race, as if he was promising more than just patience with book hunting. From that afternoon forward, Taylor became as much a part of church book's rhythm as the morning coffee ritual or the evening closing routine. He appeared most days around 3 o'clock, sometimes carrying a laptop bag that suggested he was a writer of some kind, though he never mentioned his profession directly. He would settle into one of the reading chairs with whatever book Nadia recommended, but inevitably, their conversations would drift toward the ongoing search for echoes of small towns. I've contacted 3 estate sale companies and 2 rare book dealers, Nadia reported one afternoon, pulling a leather journal from behind the counter. One dealer in Boston thinks he might have a lead, but it could take several weeks to verify. You're keeping a journal about the search? Taylor asked, something tender in his voice as he watched her flip through pages covered in her careful handwriting. I keep journals about all my special quests, Nadia admitted. Every rare book has a story, not just the story inside its covers, but the story of how it travels from reader to reader. I like to document those journeys. Taylor leaned closer to see the pages, and Nadia became hyper-aware of his proximity, the way his sleeve brushed against her arm, the scent of his skin mixing with the familiar bookstore aromas. You write beautifully, he said, reading over her notes. Your handwriting looks like it belongs in a 19th-century love letter. The compliment, delivered with such genuine admiration, sent warmth flooding through Nadia's entire being. My mother taught me calligraphy, she said softly. She believed that beautiful thoughts deserved beautiful presentation. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. Nadia's voice caught slightly. She's the one who built our rare books collection. Every first edition downstairs was chosen with love, with the belief that special books should find their way to people who will treasure them. Taylor was quiet for a moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her feel as if he could see straight through to her soul. And what about you? He asked finally. What kind of books do you treasure? Stories about people who refuse to give up on love, Nadia said without thinking, then felt her cheeks warm at the admission. Books that remind us that connection is possible even when everything seems impossible. The way Taylor looked at her when she said it made the entire world seem to narrow down to the space between them, to the shared breath and racing heartbeats that suggested they were talking about much more than literature. Their working relationship developed a rhythm of intimate efficiency. Taylor would arrive in the afternoons and help with various bookstore tasks, reaching high shelves, moving heavy boxes, organizing returns, while they discussed their progress on finding the elusive first edition. These shared activities created countless opportunities for proximity that felt both accidental and inevitable. Can you hand me that volume from the top shelf? Nadia would ask, and Taylor would move close behind her, his chest nearly touching her back as he reached over her head. The simple act of passing books between them became charged with electricity, their fingers lingering longer than necessary when their hands met. One evening, as autumn darkness fell early and rain began pattering against the windows, they found themselves working side by side to catalog a new shipment of poetry collections. The warm glow of table lamps created intimate pools of light throughout the store, and the soft jazz playing from Nadia's vintage radio filled the comfortable silences between their conversations. Listen to this, Nadia said, opening a collection of Pablo Neruda's love poems. I love you without knowing how, or when, or from where. I love you simply, without problems or pride. She looked up to find Taylor watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Isn't that the most honest way to describe love? Simple and without explanation? Do you believe in that kind of love? Taylor asked, his voice rougher than usual. Love without explanation? Nadia felt her pulse quicken at the way he was looking at her. I want to, she admitted. I used to think love required perfect timing, perfect circumstances, perfect compatibility. But maybe the most powerful connections are the ones that make no logical sense, the ones that just are. Taylor moved closer, ostensibly to see the book in her hands, but Nadia could feel the heat radiating from his body, could count the flecks of green in his blue eyes. What if the person you're falling for is carrying secrets? He asked quietly. What if loving them means accepting things you don't understand? Everyone carries secrets, Nadia whispered, very aware of how little space remained between them. The question is whether those secrets come from a place of love or fear. For a moment, the air between them crackled with possibility. Taylor's hand moved as if to touch her face, and Nadia felt herself leaning toward him, drawn by a magnetism that seemed to defy explanation. But then the bell above the front door chimed, announcing a late customer, and they stepped apart as if awakening from a shared dream. The moment of near intimacy left them both shaken and hyper-aware of each other. In the days that followed, their conversations carried an undercurrent of tension that was both thrilling and terrifying. They began staying later each evening, finding excuses to extend their time together, organizing the poetry section, researching obscure authors, sharing coffee and pastries from the local bakery. I've never met anyone who understands books the way you do, Taylor said one evening as they sat in the reading nook, sharing a thermos of hot chocolate Nadia had made in the store's tiny kitchen. You don't just read stories, you live inside them. Books saved my life, Nadia confessed, surprised by her own openness. After my mother died, after my ex-fiancé left, after every moment when I wondered if I was strong enough to keep going, books reminded me that every story has the possibility of a beautiful ending. Even love stories that seem impossible? Taylor asked, his eyes fixed on her face. Especially those, Nadia replied, meeting his gaze with a boldness that surprised them both. The tension between them continued building until it reached a crescendo on a Friday evening in late October. They had been searching through the rare manuscripts collection, looking for any leads that might help locate the elusive first edition of Echoes of Small Towns. The task required them to work in close proximity, carefully examining fragile documents by lamplight, their hands occasionally brushing as they passed materials between them. This is beautiful, Nadia murmured, holding up a handwritten manuscript page from a local author's unpublished novel. Look at the way the ink has aged to this gorgeous sepia tone. And the handwriting, you can see the passion in every letter. Taylor leaned over her shoulder to examine the page, his breath warm against her neck. The handwriting reminds me of yours, he said softly. That same careful attention to beauty. Nadia turned to respond and found herself face to face with him, their mouths only inches apart. The manuscript page fluttered forgotten to the floor as they stared at each other, the weight of weeks of growing attraction finally reaching its breaking point. Nadia, Taylor whispered, his voice rough with longing. Yes, she breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Slowly, as if giving her time to pull away, Taylor reached up to cup her face in his hands. His thumbs traced the line of her cheekbones with reverent gentleness, and Nadia felt her eyes flutter closed at the tenderness of the touch. I've wanted to do this since the moment I walked into your store, he confessed, his forehead resting against hers. Then do it, Nadia whispered, abandoning every self-protective instinct in favor of the magnetic pull that had been drawing them together for weeks. Taylor's lips were almost touching hers when the sound of the front door chime echoed through the store, followed by Professor Theodore's voice calling, Nadia? Are you still down there? They sprang apart as if struck by lightning, both breathing hard, both struggling to regain their composure. Taylor ran a hand through his hair, his cheeks flushed, while Nadia smoothed her skirt with trembling hands. "Coming, Daddy," she called, her voice higher than usual. As footsteps approached the rare book section, Taylor picked up the fallen manuscript page and handed it to Nadia, their fingers brushing in a touch that sent electricity shooting through both of them. "This isn't finished," he said quietly, his eyes holding promises that made Nadia's knees weak. "No," she agreed, her voice barely a whisper. "It isn't." When Professor Theodore appeared in the doorway, he found them standing at a respectable distance, apparently absorbed in examining rare manuscripts. But something in the charged atmosphere, in the way they avoided looking directly at each other, told him that he had interrupted something significant. "Just wanted to make sure you weren't working too late," Theodore said carefully, his protective instincts on high alert. "You know how you lose track of time when you're passionate about a project." "We were just finishing up," Nadia said, still not quite meeting Taylor's eyes. "Taylor was helping me organize some manuscripts." "How generous of him," Theodore replied, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp as they assessed the mysterious man who was clearly affecting his daughter in ways that both thrilled and worried him. As they said their goodnights and Taylor prepared to leave, Nadia walked him to the front door, both of them acutely aware that everything had changed between them. The almost kiss had shifted their relationship into new territory, territory that was both exciting and dangerous. "Will I see you tomorrow?" Nadia asked, trying to keep her voice casual despite the way her heart was racing. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," Taylor replied, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. As she watched him disappear into the October night, Nadia pressed her fingers to her lips, still tingling from their near-miss kiss. She had no idea that the man walking away from her store was actually the author she'd been helping him find, or that his growing feelings for her were about to force him into an impossible choice between love and honesty. But she did know, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that she was falling in love with a man who might just be too good to be true. Chapter 4. The weekend following their interrupted almost kiss passed in a haze of anticipation and nervous energy for both Nadia and Taylor. Saturday brought a steady stream of customers to Church Books, but Nadia found herself glancing toward the front door every few minutes, her pulse quickening each time the bell chimed. When Taylor didn't appear, she told herself it was probably for the best, they needed time to process what had almost happened between them. But Sunday afternoon found her restless and distracted, unable to concentrate on the inventory reports that demanded her attention. She kept remembering the feel of Taylor's hands cupping her face, the warmth in his eyes just before Professor Theodore had interrupted them, the promise in his voice when he'd said, "This isn't finished." "You're wearing a hole in that carpet," Danny observed from behind the counter, where he was updating their online inventory. "Want to tell me what's got you pacing like a caged poet?" Before Nadia could answer, the familiar chime announced an arrival, and there was Taylor, carrying a white pastry box and wearing an expression that was equal parts nervous and determined. "I brought peace offerings," he said, holding up the box. "Croissants from Hartwell's Bakery and an apology for Friday night." "You don't need to apologize," Nadia said quickly, her cheeks warming at the memory. "We were both caught up in something neither of us expected," Taylor finished, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "But I don't want to pretend it didn't happen, and I don't want you to think I'm the kind of man who takes advantage of a moment." Danny cleared his throat loudly. "I'm going to go organize the stockroom," he announced with the diplomatic timing of someone who recognized adult feelings when he saw them. "Take your time with whatever conversation you need to have." As Danny disappeared into the back room, Nadia and Taylor stood facing each other across the familiar space that had become charged with new meaning. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the front windows caught the golden flecks in Nadia's eyes, and Taylor felt his resolve to take things slowly beginning to crumble. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about Friday," he admitted. "About what might have happened if we hadn't been interrupted." "Neither have I," Nadia confessed, surprised by her own boldness. "I keep wondering if it would have been a mistake or the beginning of something extraordinary," Taylor finished softly. They shared the croissants at the small table by the window, their conversation flowing from literature to philosophy to the small observations about life that revealed the deeper currents of their personalities. Taylor talked about his travels, carefully edited versions of his book tours, while Nadia shared stories about growing up surrounded by books, about customers who had become like family, about the weight of carrying on a legacy that sometimes felt too big for her shoulders. "You never talk about the future," Taylor observed as they watched the afternoon light begin to fade. "You speak about preserving the past, about honoring your mother's memory, but what do you want for yourself? Beyond keeping the store alive?" Nadia was quiet for a long moment, considering the question that no one had ever asked her so directly. "I used to want adventure," she said finally. "I dreamed about traveling to small bookstores around the world, learning how different cultures approach literature. I imagined writing travel articles about literary destinations, or maybe even a book about the universal language of stories." "What changed?" Taylor asked gently. "Life," Nadia said with a rueful smile. "Responsibility. The realization that some dreams are luxuries we can't afford." She paused, then looked directly at him. "What about you? What do you dream about when you're not helping me search for rare books?" Taylor felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with navigating the line between truth and deception. "I dream about finding home," he said carefully. "About creating something that matters, something that will outlast me. About connecting with someone who sees the world the way I do." "And have you found home, I mean?" Taylor's eyes held hers with an intensity that made the world seem to narrow down to just the two of them. "I'm starting to think I have." As if summoned by the emotion building between them, dark clouds began gathering outside the windows, and the wind picked up with the promise of another autumn storm. By 6 o'clock, when Danny finished in the stockroom and prepared to leave for his evening classes, rain was beginning to fall in earnest. "Looks like we're in for another big one," Danny observed, pulling on his raincoat. "You sure you don't want me to stay and help you close up?" "I'll be fine," Nadia assured him, though she was eyeing the darkening sky with concern. "Drive carefully, the roads get slippery when the leaves are wet." After Danny left, Nadia and Taylor found themselves alone again as the storm intensified outside. The wind howled around the old building, rattling windows and sending tree branches scraping against the glass. When the lights flickered ominously, Nadia moved to the storage closet and retrieved the emergency candles she kept for just such occasions. "Déjà vu," Taylor said, watching her light candles throughout the store. "Though this time, I'm not a stranger seeking shelter." "No," Nadia agreed, meeting his eyes across the flickering candlelight. "This time, you're—" "What am I, Nadia?" Taylor asked, moving closer to where she stood arranging candles on the counter. Before she could answer, the lights went out completely, plunging them into the intimate glow of candlelight. The storm outside seemed to intensify in response, as if nature itself was conspiring to create another cocoon of intimacy around them. "I should probably try to get home before this gets worse," Taylor said, though he made no move toward the door. "The roads will be dangerous," Nadia said quickly. "You could wait it out here. The storm might pass in a few hours." They both knew she was offering more than just shelter from the weather, and they both knew he was going to accept. As the storm raged outside with increasing fury, they settled into the reading nook with books and blankets, sharing stories and observations by candlelight. The cozy space, illuminated by the warm glow of a dozen candles, felt removed from the rest of the world, like a secret sanctuary where normal rules didn't apply. "Tell me something you've never told anyone else," Taylor said as they sat facing each other on the vintage Persian rug, close enough that their knees almost touched. Nadia was quiet for a moment, studying his face in the flickering light. Something about the intimate atmosphere, the way the storm had cut them off from the outside world, made her feel safe enough to be completely honest. I'm terrified that I'm not enough, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. That I'm going to be the church woman who loses everything 3 generations built. My mother was brilliant, she had this instinct for books, for business, for connecting with people. She made everything look effortless. And I feel like I'm just pretending to be her. Taylor moved closer on the rug, his expression tender with understanding. Nadia, you're not pretending to be anyone. What you've built here, the way you care for books and customers, the passion you bring to everything you do, that's all you. But what if it's not enough? The words came out on a sob that surprised them both. What if passion isn't sufficient to save something? What if I have to choose between my heart and my head, between keeping the store's soul and keeping it alive? Without thinking, Taylor reached out and took her hands in his, the contact sending warmth shooting through both of them. Tell me what's really happening, he said gently. What choice are you facing? And somehow, in the candlelit sanctuary they'd created, with his hands holding hers and his eyes full of genuine concern, Nadia found herself telling him everything. About Charlotte O'Neill's increasing offers for the rare book collection. About the mounting bills and decreasing customers. About the horrible arithmetic that suggested she might have to sacrifice the heart of her mother's legacy to save what remained. I lie awake at night doing calculations, she confessed, tears beginning to fall. Wondering if I'm being selfish, if my attachment to those books is just sentimentality that's going to cost me everything. But those books. They're not just valuable objects. They're connections to every person who's ever treasured them. My mother believed that rare books should be accessible, that they should find their way to people who need them. Taylor listened with an intensity that made Nadia feel truly heard for the first time in months. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his thumbs tracing gentle circles over her knuckles. What if there was another way, he asked finally. What if you could save the store without sacrificing the collection? How? Nadia asked, hope and skepticism warring in her voice. Taylor hesitated, and for a moment, Nadia thought he was going to tell her something important, something that might change everything. But then he seemed to catch himself, and instead said, sometimes solutions come from unexpected places. Sometimes the help we need is closer than we think. The cryptic answer puzzled Nadia, but before she could ask what he meant, thunder crashed directly overhead, so loud it seemed to shake the building's foundations. The sound startled them both, and Nadia found herself instinctively moving closer to Taylor for comfort. It's okay, he murmured, wrapping his arms around her as she trembled against him. Just a storm. We're safe here. But something about being held in his arms, about the tenderness in his voice and the steady strength of his heartbeat against her ear, broke through the last of Nadia's carefully maintained composure. All the stress and fear and loneliness she'd been carrying for 2 years came pouring out in tears that seemed to come from her very soul. Taylor held her through it all, one hand stroking her hair while the other rubbed gentle circles on her back. He whispered soft reassurances, words of comfort that seemed to reach parts of her heart she'd forgotten existed. When her tears finally subsided, she remained in his arms, feeling safer and more cherished than she had since her mother's death. I'm sorry, she whispered against his chest. I don't usually fall apart like that. Don't apologize, Taylor said firmly, his lips brushing against her hair. You're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. You're allowed to let someone else help hold it up occasionally. Nadia pulled back slightly to look at his face, struck by the genuine care she saw there. Why do you care so much? About me, about the store? We barely know each other. Taylor's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs gently wiping away the last of her tears. Sometimes knowing someone isn't about time, he said softly. Sometimes it's about recognition. And I recognized you the moment I walked into your store. Recognized me as what? As someone worth knowing. Worth protecting. Worth. He paused, as if he was about to say something that would change everything between them. Worth loving. The words hung in the air between them, electric and transformative. Nadia felt her heart stop, then begin beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Taylor," she whispered, her voice full of wonder and fear and hope. "I know it's fast," he said quickly. "I know it doesn't make logical sense. But what I feel for you, it's not something I can explain or control or talk myself out of." Instead of responding with words, Nadia reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with reverent gentleness. The simple touch made Taylor's eyes flutter closed, and when he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. They stayed that way for a long moment, holding each other in the candlelit cocoon while the storm raged outside. Neither spoke of love again that night, but the word had been said, had taken root in the space between them, growing stronger with every shared breath. As the storm gradually lessened and exhaustion began to claim them both, they arranged themselves in the reading chairs facing each other, neither wanting to suggest that Taylor should attempt the drive home. Nadia curled up in her chair wrapped in a soft throw blanket, while Taylor settled in the chair across from her, their legs stretching toward each other until their feet were almost touching. "Sleep," Taylor said softly. "I'll keep watch." "You don't have to protect me from anything," Nadia murmured, already drowsy from emotional exhaustion and the comfort of knowing she wasn't alone. "Yes, I do," Taylor replied, so quietly she wasn't sure if she'd heard him or dreamed it. Nadia fell asleep watching the play of candlelight across Taylor's face, feeling more peaceful than she had in months. She didn't see the way he watched her sleep with an expression of wonder and growing determination. She didn't hear him whisper promises into the quiet darkness, vows to find a way to help her save everything she loved without revealing the secret that could destroy what was growing between them. When dawn broke soft and golden through the front windows, Nadia awakened to find Taylor's wool jacket draped carefully over her shoulders, still warm with his body heat and carrying his cedar and sandalwood scent. He was sleeping peacefully in the chair across from her, his face relaxed in a way she'd never seen before, and she found herself studying the gentle curve of his mouth, the way his dark lashes cast shadows on his cheeks. This was intimacy, she realized. Not just physical closeness, but this profound trust, this willingness to be vulnerable and unguarded with another person. Watching him sleep felt like being trusted with something precious and fragile. When Taylor began to stir, Nadia didn't look away. Their eyes met across the small space between their chairs, and neither spoke for a long moment, both understanding that something fundamental had shifted between them during the night. "Good morning," Taylor said finally, his voice rough with sleep and something deeper. "Good morning," Nadia replied, pulling his jacket closer around her shoulders. "Thank you for staying. Thank you for letting me." They shared coffee and leftover pastries as morning light gradually filled the store, neither mentioning the previous night's confession of love, both knowing that it couldn't be taken back. The emotional intimacy they'd achieved felt both thrilling and terrifying, opening up possibilities that neither had expected. Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened in ways that felt both natural and miraculous. Taylor began arriving earlier and staying later, helping with inventory and repairs, listening to Nadia's stories about difficult customers and celebrating her small victories. They developed a rhythm of shared meals and quiet conversations, of comfortable silences and moments of electric connection. Professor Theodore watched these developments with the careful attention of a man who understood that his daughter was falling in love with someone who might break her heart. During one of Taylor's visits, he engaged the younger man in a conversation about literature that was really an interrogation about his intentions. "Nadia tells me you're helping her search for a particular book," Theodore said, settling into his reading chair with the deliberate authority of someone claiming his territory. "Echoes of Small Towns," Taylor confirmed, his expression carefully neutral. "It's a beautiful novel." "Indeed. Though I find it curious that someone would go to such lengths to find a book that's readily available in paperback." Taylor met the older man's penetrating gaze steadily. "Some books are worth having in their original form. First editions carry the author's original intention, before editors and publishers made changes." "And what do you intend to do with this first edition?" should Nadia succeed in finding it? The question carried weight beyond its surface meaning, and Taylor understood that he was being asked about more than book collecting. "I intend to treasure it," he said quietly. "To make sure it's appreciated for what it truly is." Professor Theodore studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "See that you do." Meanwhile, other complications were beginning to emerge. Charlotte O'Neill's offers were becoming more insistent, accompanied by subtle threats about other collectors who might not be as patient. Rebecca Watson had been calling Taylor's phone with increasing frequency, demanding to know when he planned to return to New York for his upcoming book commitments. And Lila Kent, with her artist's eye for detail, was beginning to piece together clues about Taylor's true identity. "There's something familiar about your mysterious book lover," Lila told Nadia one afternoon as they arranged a new display of local art books. "I keep feeling like I've seen his face somewhere before." "He just has one of those faces," Nadia said quickly, though she'd been having the same strange feeling of recognition. "Maybe," Lila said thoughtfully. "Or maybe he's someone who's supposed to stay mysterious." But despite the growing complications, despite the secrets that lay between them like unexploded mines, Nadia and Taylor continued to fall deeper in love with each passing day. They were building something beautiful and fragile, something that felt worth protecting at any cost. Neither could have predicted that the cost of their growing love would soon demand a choice between truth and happiness, between the safety of secrets and the terrifying vulnerability of being completely known. Chapter 5. The first sign that their perfect bubble of intimacy was about to burst came on a Tuesday morning in early November, when Charlotte O'Neill arrived at Church Books unannounced, carrying herself with the imperious confidence of someone accustomed to getting exactly what she wanted. Nadia looked up from the rare books catalog she'd been updating to find an elegantly dressed woman in her 60s standing before the counter, her silver hair perfectly coiffed and her sharp eyes already assessing the valuable volumes visible on the nearby shelves. "Ms. Church," Charlotte said without preamble, her voice carrying the crisp authority of old money and older privilege. "I believe it's time we had a face-to-face conversation about my offer." "Mrs. O'Neill," Nadia replied, rising from her chair with the careful politeness her mother had taught her to use with difficult customers. "I wasn't expecting you today." "Clearly not, or you might have prepared a more decisive answer than the endless delays I've been receiving." Charlotte's gaze swept over the store with calculating precision. "I've been more than patient, my dear, but patience has its limits. Especially when other collectors are beginning to express interest in your situation." The veiled threat sent a chill down Nadia's spine. "Other collectors?" "Word travels quickly in our circles when a significant collection might become available. There are people far less considerate than I am in their acquisition methods." Charlotte moved to examine a glass display case containing some of Eleanor Church's most prized first editions. "I'm prepared to make one final offer, 60% above my original price, but the deal must be concluded by Friday." "Friday?" Nadia's voice came out higher than intended. "That's only 3 days away. Time enough for any reasonable person to recognize an extraordinary opportunity." Charlotte's tone suggested that failure to accept would place Nadia firmly in the unreasonable category. "I'll expect your answer by noon on Friday, Ms. Church. After that, I'll be exploring other options." After Charlotte left, trailing the scent of expensive perfume and barely contained impatience, Nadia sank into her chair feeling as if the walls were closing in around her. The enhanced offer would solve her immediate financial problems and provide enough cushion to keep the store running for at least a year. But it would also mean dismantling the heart of everything her mother had built. She was still staring at Charlotte's formal written offer when Taylor arrived that afternoon, carrying his usual laptop bag and the gentle smile that had become the best part of her days. But today, instead of the usual rush of happiness at seeing him, Nadia felt only a crushing weight of responsibility and impossible choices. "You look like someone just told you Christmas was cancelled," Taylor said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "What's wrong?" Nadia handed him Charlotte's letter without speaking, watching his face as he read the formal language that reduced her mother's life work to market value and deadline pressure. "This is a substantial offer," Taylor said carefully, though something in his expression suggested he understood the true cost of accepting it. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that maybe I've been naive to believe love and passion are enough to keep something alive," Nadia said, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "Maybe Charlotte's right. Maybe holding on to the collection is just sentimentality that's going to cost me everything." Taylor leaned forward, his blue-green eyes intense with concern. "What does your heart tell you?" "My heart tells me to fight for what matters. But my accountant tells me to take the money and save what I can." Nadia laughed bitterly. "Easy choice, right? Except it doesn't feel easy at all." For a moment, Taylor looked as if he was about to say something important, something that might change everything. But then his phone buzzed insistently in his pocket, and when he glanced at the screen, his expression shifted to something that looked almost like panic. "I need to take this," he said quickly, stepping outside onto the sidewalk. Through the front window, Nadia could see him pacing as he spoke, his posture tense and his gestures increasingly agitated. She couldn't hear the words, but his body language suggested an argument, and when he finally returned to the store 20 minutes later, he looked shaken. "Everything okay?" Nadia asked, noting the way he avoided meeting her eyes directly. "Just work," Taylor said vaguely, but something in his tone rang false. "Sorry about that. You were saying about Charlotte's offer?" But the moment of potential revelation had passed, leaving Nadia with a strange sense that she'd missed something important, something that might have provided answers to questions she didn't even know she should be asking. The pattern of mysterious phone calls and evasive explanations began to accelerate over the following days. Taylor's laptop bag, which he'd always kept casually nearby, was now guarded with subtle but noticeable care. When customers asked about his profession, his answers became increasingly vague, and twice Nadia caught him giving conflicting information about his background. "I thought you said you were from Vermont," she mentioned after a customer left, "but yesterday you told Mrs. Patterson you grew up in New Hampshire." Taylor's pause was just long enough to be noticeable. "I moved around a lot as a child," he said finally. "Sometimes I forget which state people are asking about." It was a reasonable explanation, but something about the way he delivered it made Nadia's instincts prickle with unease. The sense that Taylor was hiding something significant crystallized on Wednesday afternoon when a woman Nadia had never seen before burst through the front door of Church Books with the focused intensity of someone on a mission. She was in her 40s, impeccably dressed in a sharp business suit, and her dark eyes swept the store until they landed on Taylor, who had been helping Danny organize the poetry section. "There you are," the woman said, her voice carrying both relief and exasperation. "Do you have any idea how difficult it's been to track you down? Your phone goes straight to voicemail, your assistant claims you're unavailable, and I've been calling every bookstore within 100 miles trying to find you." Taylor had gone very still, his face carefully blank in a way Nadia had never seen before. "Rebecca," he said quietly. "I told you I needed time." "Time?" Rebecca's voice rose with professional frustration. "Taylor, you have the Morrison interview next week, the literary festival in Boston the week after that, and your editor is demanding to know when you're planning to deliver the final draft of your new novel. You can't just disappear and expect the literary world to wait for you to finish. Whatever this is." The words hit Nadia like a physical blow. Morrison interview. Literary festival. Editor. Novel. Each word recontextualized every conversation they'd had, every moment of supposed honesty, every careful deflection she'd attributed to shyness or natural reserve. "Who are you?" Nadia asked, the question emerging as barely a whisper. Taylor turned to look at her, and the expression on his face, guilt and desperation and something that might have been grief, told her everything she needed to know before he spoke a single word. "Rebecca Watson," the woman said, apparently oblivious to the emotional devastation unfolding before her. "I'm Taylor's literary agent." "And you are?" The woman who's been helping him find a first edition of his own book, Nadia said, her voice deadly quiet. The woman who's been telling him how brilliant Taylor Grayson's writing is, not knowing I was talking to Taylor Grayson himself. The silence that followed was so complete that Nadia could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Rebecca looked between them with the dawning realization that she had just detonated something delicate and precious. Danny, who had been pretending not to listen from behind the poetry stacks, stood frozen with a volume of Neruda clutched in his hands. "Nadia," Taylor said, his voice breaking on her name. "Please let me explain." "Explain what?" Nadia asked, stepping back as if his proximity was suddenly dangerous. "Explain how you've been lying to me for weeks. Explain how you've been letting me make a fool of myself, gushing about your own work like some starstruck fan. Explain how everything I thought I knew about you is apparently fiction." "Not everything," Taylor said desperately, reaching toward her. "Not what matters. Not what I feel for you." But Nadia flinched away from his touch as if it might burn her. "How would I know what's real? How would I know anything when you've been performing for me this entire time?" Rebecca, finally grasping the magnitude of what her arrival had caused, attempted damage control. "Perhaps I should leave you two to discuss this privately." "No," Nadia said firmly. "You should take him with you. Take him back to his real life, his important interviews and literary festivals. Take him back to the world that actually matters." "Nadia, please," Taylor's voice was raw with desperation. "I need you to leave," Nadia said, her composure cracking to reveal the hurt underneath. "I need you both to leave. Now." Professor Theodore chose that moment to descend from his apartment, drawn by the sound of raised voices and his protective instincts where his daughter was concerned. He took in the scene with sharp eyes, Nadia's devastated expression, Taylor's obvious distress, the strange woman in the expensive suit, and positioned himself between Taylor and his daughter with subtle but unmistakable authority. "I believe the lady asked you to leave," Theodore said quietly, his academic politeness somehow more threatening than any raised voice could have been. Rebecca, recognizing a volatile situation when she saw one, took Taylor's arm with professional efficiency. "Come on," she said. "We can talk about this somewhere else." But Taylor resisted, his eyes fixed on Nadia's face as if memorizing it. "This isn't how I wanted you to find out," he said. "I was trying to find the right way to tell you." "When?" Nadia asked, her voice shaking with suppressed emotion. "After you'd gotten tired of playing small-town bookstore owner with the naive little woman? After you'd had your research for your next novel about quaint rural life?" The accusation hit Taylor like a physical blow. "It was never like that. What I feel for you, what you feel for me is based on lies," Nadia interrupted. "Everything between us is based on lies. The man who held you during the storm, who listened to your fears about losing the store, who told you he was falling in love with you, that man wasn't lying," Taylor said desperately. "That man is real, Nadia. That man is me." "No," Nadia said, tears beginning to fall despite her efforts to maintain composure. "That man was a character you were playing. The real you is someone who thought it was acceptable to deceive me for weeks, to let me worry about helping you find a book you wrote yourself, to let me fall in love with someone who doesn't exist." The words "fall in love" hung in the air between them, making the betrayal even more cruel. Taylor's face crumpled as if she'd struck him. "I exist," he whispered. "Everything I told you about wanting to find home, about recognizing you, about falling in love, all of that is real." "Built on a foundation of lies," Professor Theodore interjected, his protective anger finally breaking through his academic reserve. "You deceived my daughter. You took advantage of her trust, her kindness, her professional expertise. And for what? Entertainment? Research? For love," Taylor said simply, his eyes never leaving Nadia's face. "I did it for love." "Love doesn't begin with deception," Nadia said, her voice breaking. Love begins with honesty, with seeing someone clearly and choosing them anyway. What you felt for me was based on some fantasy version of who you thought I was, some simple small-town woman who would be grateful for your attention. That's not true, isn't it? Nadia's anger was building now, burning through the hurt. The famous author slumming it with the little bookstore owner? How quaint. How authentic. How perfectly charming for someone who's lost touch with his small-town roots. You're wrong, Taylor said fiercely. You're wrong about everything. Yes, I lied about who I was, but I never lied about what you mean to me. You're not some research project or amusing diversion. You're the most real thing that's happened to me in years. I can't, Nadia said, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to hold the pieces together. I can't do this right now. I need you to leave. Rebecca, who had been waiting with increasing impatience, finally intervened. Taylor, we really do need to go. You have obligations. My only obligation is to her, Taylor said, his voice raw with emotion. No, Nadia said firmly. Your obligation is to your real life. The life you were apparently so eager to escape that you had to create an entirely false identity to get away from it. Have you ever had to choose between protecting your heart and following it? These moments of truth define who we become. If this story is speaking to your soul, please hit that like button and subscribe. Your support helps me bring you more stories about the courage it takes to love authentically despite our fears. The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of Lila Kent, who had promised to stop by with some art books for the new display. She paused in the doorway, taking in the charged atmosphere and the obvious distress on Nadia's face. Is everything all right? Lila asked, her artist's instincts immediately picking up on the emotional devastation in the room. Everything's fine, Nadia said, though her voice suggested the opposite. Mr. Grayson was just leaving. Lila's eyes widened with recognition. Grayson? As in Taylor Grayson, the author? She looked between Taylor and Nadia with growing understanding. Oh, honey. Oh no. The confirmation from yet another source seemed to be the final straw for Nadia's composure. Everyone knows but me, she said wonderingly. Everyone except the foolish woman who's been helping him find his own book. Nadia, Taylor began. Go, she said, her voice hollow with exhaustion. Just go. Take your agent and your real life and your literary festivals, and go. Rebecca, recognizing that further delay would only make things worse, firmly guided Taylor toward the door. He resisted for a moment, looking back at Nadia with an expression of such raw pain that even Professor Theodore felt a moment of sympathy. This isn't over, Taylor said quietly. I won't let it be over. It has to be, Nadia replied without looking at him. Because I don't know who you are, and I don't think you know either. As the door closed behind them, the silence in church books felt heavier than any storm. Professor Theodore moved to his daughter's side, offering the wordless comfort of his presence, while Lila quietly began straightening book displays, giving Nadia space to process what had just happened. I'm such a fool, Nadia whispered finally. No, Professor Theodore said firmly. You're a woman who trusted someone with her heart. The fact that he wasn't worthy of that trust doesn't make you foolish, it makes him unworthy. But even as her father's words offered comfort, Nadia couldn't shake the memory of the pain in Taylor's eyes as he'd looked back at her, couldn't forget the way his voice had broken when he'd said her name. Part of her wanted to believe that his feelings had been real, that somewhere beneath the deception was the man who had held her during the storm and promised to protect her from anything. The other part of her, the part that was already beginning to build walls around her wounded heart, whispered that believing in that man would only lead to more pain. Outside, Taylor sat in Rebecca's rental car feeling as if his world had just collapsed around him. The woman he loved thought he was a liar and a manipulator. The connection he'd treasured as the most real thing in his life had been reduced to research and performance in her eyes. And the worst part was that he couldn't entirely blame her for feeling that way. Well, Rebecca said as she started the engine, that could have gone better. Taylor didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the warm light still glowing in church books' windows, wondering if he would ever be welcome in that sanctuary again, wondering if the love he'd found and lost in the space of a single conversation could ever be repaired. The answer, like everything else in his suddenly uncertain world, remained agonizingly unclear. Chapter 6. The silence that filled church books after Taylor and Rebecca's departure felt like the aftermath of an earthquake. Everything looked the same on the surface, but the very foundations had shifted beneath Nadia's feet. She stood motionless in the center of her sanctuary, surrounded by thousands of books that had always been sources of comfort, and felt utterly, completely alone. "Sweetheart," Professor Theodore said gently, "why don't you come upstairs? I'll make some tea." "I can't," Nadia whispered, her voice hollow. "If I go upstairs, if I stop moving, I might fall apart completely. And I can't afford to fall apart right now. Not with Charlotte's deadline, not with everything else." Lila, who had been quietly organizing art books with the tactful wisdom of someone who understood heartbreak, looked up from her work. "Honey, sometimes falling apart is exactly what we need to do. Sometimes it's the only way to put ourselves back together properly." But Nadia shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself as if that could hold the pieces in place. "I trusted him," she said, the words emerging like a confession. "I told him things I've never told anyone else. I let him see me vulnerable, let him comfort me, let him." She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the depth of intimacy they'd shared. "Let him into your heart," Professor Theodore completed softly. "Based on lies," Nadia said bitterly. "Everything he told me about himself, about his background, about why he wanted that book, all of it was fiction." "Not everything," Lila said carefully. "I saw the way he looked at you, Nadia. I've been painting people for 20 years, and I know real emotion when I see it. Whatever else he lied about, his feelings for you weren't part of the performance." "How can you know that?" Nadia demanded, her hurt transmuting into anger. "How can anyone know what was real when the entire foundation was built on deception? Maybe I was just research for his next novel. Maybe small-town bookstore owner falls for famous author is exactly the kind of quaint story his readers would love." The thought made her feel physically sick, imagining herself reduced to character notes in someone else's narrative, her genuine feelings transformed into material for entertainment. After Professor Theodore and Lila finally convinced her to close the store early, Nadia found herself alone with her thoughts for the first time since the devastating revelation. She moved through her evening routine mechanically, locking doors, turning off lights, checking the register, but her mind kept circling back to every conversation she'd had with Taylor, recontextualizing everything through the lens of his deception. The way he'd asked such insightful questions about echoes of small towns. Of course he'd written every word. The careful way he'd discussed his travels. Book tours, probably, not the casual wandering he'd implied. His expensive watch, his quality clothes, the way he moved through the world with quiet confidence, all of it suddenly made perfect sense. But what devastated her most was the memory of their intimate moments. The way he'd held her during the storm, the tenderness in his voice when he'd told her she had healing hands, the raw honesty in his eyes when he'd confessed he was falling in love with her. Had all of that been calculated? Performed? Had she really been so naive, so starved for connection, that she'd fallen for an act? Sleep was impossible. Nadia spent the night staring at her bedroom ceiling, alternating between hurt and humiliation and an anger that burned in her chest like acid. By dawn, she felt hollow, emptied out, as if all her emotions had been wrung from her like water from a cloth. She was grateful for the routine of opening the store, for the familiar ritual that required no thought or feeling. Danny arrived at his usual time, took one look at her face, and asked no questions, simply setting about his tasks with unusual quiet efficiency. The morning passed in a blur of mundane activities, receiving a shipment of new books, helping Mrs. Patterson find the latest mystery novel, updating their inventory system. It was just after lunch when Nadia made the discovery that would change everything. She had been avoiding the rare books section all morning, unable to face the space where she and Taylor had shared so many intimate conversations. But Charlie O'Neill's deadline was looming, and she needed to create a comprehensive catalog of her mother's collection for the potential sale. Forcing herself to be professional, Nadia made her way to the climate-controlled alcove where the most valuable volumes were kept. She was working methodically through the poetry section when her fingers encountered a familiar spine, a first edition of Echoes of Small Towns that she'd forgotten was part of the collection. Her mother had acquired it shortly after the novel's publication, drawn by the beautiful prose and small-town setting that reminded her of Millbrook. Nadia pulled the volume from the shelf with hands that trembled slightly, remembering how excited she'd been to help Taylor find this exact book. The irony was almost unbearable. She'd been searching everywhere for something that had been in her own collection all along. She opened the book carefully, intending only to check its condition for the catalog, but what she found inside made her sink into the nearby reading chair with a gasp of shock. The margins were filled with handwriting. Not just any handwriting, Taylor's handwriting. She recognized it immediately from the notes he'd written while helping her with inventory, from the little messages he'd left when he borrowed books. But these weren't casual annotations. These were intimate, personal notes that seemed to pour directly from the author's heart onto the pages of his own work. On page 37, next to a passage about the protagonist's fear of leaving his hometown. Was I brave to leave, or was I running away from the only place that ever felt real? On page 81, beside a description of the bookstore that served as the novel's emotional center, every bookstore should feel like home. Every bookstore should have someone like her to guard its secrets. On page 115, next to the climactic scene where the protagonist finally understands what he's been searching for, home isn't a place. Home is recognition. Home is finding someone who sees your truest self. But it was the inscription on the title page that broke Nadia's heart completely. Written in Taylor's careful script, dated just 2 weeks ago, for N, you showed me that this story was really about finding you. All of it was about finding you, even before I knew you existed. T. The inscription was recent, written after he'd started visiting the store, after he'd begun falling in love with her. Which meant this book had been here all along, part of her collection, and somehow Taylor had found it, had been reading it, had been writing his heart into the margins while she searched desperately for the very book he was secretly annotating with love letters. Nadia stared at the pages until her vision blurred with tears, understanding flooding through her with devastating clarity. This wasn't research. This wasn't performance. This was a man trying to understand his own story, his own heart, through the lens of falling in love with her. The annotations revealed the depth of his internal struggle, the way his feelings for her had transformed his understanding of his own work. Page after page contained evidence of a man grappling with questions of authenticity, home, identity, and love. These weren't the cold observations of someone using her for material, they were the desperate confessions of someone trying to reconcile his public persona with his private truth. "Oh, Taylor," she whispered to the empty room, her anger beginning to crack under the weight of understanding. She read every notation, every margin comment, every place where his pen had touched the pages of his own story. By the time she finished, the sun was setting outside the tall windows, casting golden light across the evidence of his torment and love. The final annotation, written on the last page of the novel, was dated just 3 days ago, the day before Rebecca's arrival had destroyed everything. I have to tell her the truth. She deserves honesty, even if it costs me everything. Even if she can never forgive me for waiting so long. So he had been planning to tell her. The revelation hadn't been forced by Rebecca's interference, he had already decided to confess, to risk their relationship for the sake of honesty. The knowledge didn't erase the hurt of his deception, but it transformed it, adding layers of complexity that made her anger feel suddenly inadequate. Nadia closed the book and held it against her chest, feeling as if her entire understanding of the past weeks was rearranging itself like puzzle pieces finding their proper places. Taylor Grayson, the famous author, had lied to her, yes. But Taylor, the man who wrote love letters in the margins of his own book, who struggled with questions of authenticity and belonging, who had been planning to risk everything for truth, that man was real. The question was, which man did she love? The answer, she realized with stunning clarity, was both. She loved the mysterious stranger who had sought shelter in her store, and she loved the celebrated author who had written words that moved her soul. She loved the man who had comforted her during storms, and she loved the writer whose marginalia revealed a heart that matched her own in its longing for authentic connection. What she couldn't forgive, what still burned in her chest like a brand, was the weeks of deception. Not because it proved his feelings were false, but because it proved he hadn't trusted her enough to be honest. He had chosen to protect himself rather than trust her with the truth, and that choice had tainted everything beautiful they had built together. As if summoned by her revelation, the bell above the front door chimed softly. Nadia looked up from the book in her lap to see a familiar silhouette in the doorway, and her heart began racing despite everything that had happened between them. Taylor stood just inside the entrance, looking as devastated as she felt. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his eyes held a hollow exhaustion that suggested he hadn't slept any more than she had. In his hands, he carried a manila envelope that he held like an offering. "I know you told me to leave," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "And I will, if that's really what you want. But first, I need you to understand something." Nadia stood slowly, still clutching the annotated first edition against her chest. "I understand more than you think I do." Taylor's eyes fell to the book in her arms, and she saw the moment he recognized it, saw the flash of vulnerability cross his features as he realized she had found his secret marginalia. "You read them," he said, not quite a question. "Every word." Nadia's voice was steadier than she felt. "Every confession, every question, every place where you poured your heart onto the pages of your own story." Taylor closed his eyes as if in pain. "Then you know that what I felt for you was never a lie. You know that falling in love with you changed everything, changed how I saw my own work, my own life, my own heart." "I know that you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth," Nadia replied, and despite her growing understanding, the hurt in her voice was unmistakable. "I know that you chose protection over honesty, chose your comfort over my right to know who I was falling in love with." "You're right," Taylor said simply, stepping further into the store. "I was a coward. I was terrified that if you knew who I really was, you'd see me differently. That you'd love the famous author instead of the man, or that you'd decide the man wasn't worth loving once you knew about the fame. So you took that choice away from me," Nadia said, her voice gaining strength. "You decided what I could and couldn't handle, what I deserved to know about the man I was giving my heart to." "Yes." The admission was stark, undefended. "And I was wrong. Not about loving you, never about that. But wrong to think I could build something real on a foundation of lies. Wrong to think I could protect what we had by hiding who I am." Nadia studied his face, seeing exhaustion and regret and something that looked like hope warring in his features. "What's in the envelope?" Taylor looked down at the manila packet in his hands as if he'd forgotten it existed. "Proof," he said quietly. "Proof that what I felt for you was real from the very beginning. Proof that you weren't research or entertainment or some amusing diversion from my real life." He held out the envelope, and after a moment's hesitation, Nadia set the book aside and accepted it. Inside, she found a stack of handwritten pages, journal entries, by the look of them, written in Taylor's familiar script. The first entry was dated the night of the storm when they'd first met. "Found something today I didn't know I was looking for. A bookstore, a woman, a feeling of coming home that I haven't experienced since my parents died. Her name is Nadia, and she welcomed me out of the storm like she was waiting for me. I know how that sounds, but there's something about her that feels like recognition, like my soul has been searching for hers without knowing it. Nadia's hands trembled as she read entry after entry chronicling the development of Taylor's feelings for her. His struggle with deception was documented in painful detail, along with his growing realization that he was falling in love with her authenticity, her passion, her brilliant mind and generous heart. One entry, written after their almost kiss in the manuscript section, made her breath catch, nearly told her everything tonight. The words were right there, ready to destroy whatever's growing between us. But then she looked at me with such trust, such openness, and I couldn't bear to see that change to disappointment or betrayal. Am I protecting her, or am I protecting myself? And does the motivation matter if the result is the same deception? Another, from the night they'd weathered the second storm together. She trusted me with her deepest fears tonight, and I comforted her without being able to offer the one thing that could actually solve her problems. I have the money to save her store 10 times over, the connections to bring literary tourism to Millbrook, the influence to make church books a destination for book lovers everywhere. But I can't offer any of that without revealing the lie that's poisoning everything beautiful between us. I'm trapped by my own cowardice, and she's suffering for it. The final entry was dated yesterday, the day of Rebecca's revelation. Tomorrow I'm going to tell her everything. I've rehearsed the words 100 times, imagined every possible reaction. She might hate me. She might never forgive me for the deception. But I can't build a life with someone while hiding who I am. She deserves the truth, even if it destroys us. Especially if it destroys us. Because anything we build on lies isn't worth having. Nadia looked up from the pages to find Taylor watching her with an expression of naked vulnerability. You were going to tell me, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I was terrified to tell you, Taylor corrected. But yes, I was going to. Rebecca's arrival just accelerated the timeline. Why? Nadia asked. Why were you finally ready to risk everything? Taylor moved closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes, close enough that she could smell the familiar scent of cedar and sandalwood that had become associated with comfort in her mind. Because I realized that loving you while lying to you was destroying both of us, he said quietly. Because you were suffering financial stress that I could solve, but couldn't without revealing my deception. Because every moment of happiness we shared was tainted by the knowledge that it was built on false foundation. He paused, his eyes searching her face. And because I realized that if you couldn't love me knowing the truth, then what we had wasn't real anyway. The words hung between them, heavy with possibility and pain. Nadia felt the last of her anger dissolving, replaced by a complex mixture of hurt and understanding in something that might have been the beginning of forgiveness. I don't know how to trust you again, she admitted, the confession emerging like a physical wound. I don't know how to believe that what we had was real when it started with such fundamental dishonesty. Then let me show you, Taylor said, his voice rough with desperation and hope. Let me prove that the man who held you during storms and fell in love with your brilliant mind and wanted to protect you from everything painful in the world, let me prove that man is real. That man is me. Nadia looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the famous author or the mysterious stranger, but simply a man who had made a terrible mistake and was willing to do whatever it took to repair the damage. A man whose journal entries revealed a heart that matched her own in its capacity for love and fear and hope. How? She asked, and the single word contained both challenge and invitation. However you'll let me, Taylor replied. For as long as you'll let me. Until you believe that what we have is worth fighting for, worth rebuilding on a foundation of complete honesty. As the golden autumn light faded outside the windows of church books, Nadia stood surrounded by the evidence of Taylor's genuine feelings, his journal entries, his marginalia, his desperate attempt to prove that love could survive even the deepest betrayal. She didn't know yet if forgiveness was possible, didn't know if trust could be rebuilt from the ashes of deception. But for the first time since Rebecca's devastating revelation, she found herself wanting to try. Chapter 7. The 3 days that followed Taylor's revelation passed like a held breath, charged with possibility and fraught with uncertainty. Nadia found herself reading and rereading his journal entries, studying the marginalia in his book, trying to reconcile the depth of authentic emotion she found there with the weeks of deception that had preceded them. Taylor kept his distance, respecting her need for space while making his presence quietly known. He would appear across the street at the coffee shop each morning, visible through church books' front windows, reading and writing in a notebook. Not hovering, not pressuring, but simply, there. Available if she needed him, patient in a way that spoke to genuine understanding rather than calculated manipulation. On Thursday evening, as Nadia stood in her apartment window watching him pack up his laptop and prepare to leave for another night, she realized that his patient vigil was itself a form of honesty, transparent in its devotion, vulnerable in its hopefulness. This wasn't the behavior of someone playing a role. This was the behavior of a man who had found something worth fighting for and was willing to fight for it properly. Professor Theodore had been watching his daughter's internal struggle with the careful attention of someone who understood both literature and human nature. "You know," he said over their shared Friday morning coffee, "your mother once told me that the most beautiful love stories aren't the ones without conflict, they're the ones where people choose love despite the reasons they have to walk away." "He lied to me, Daddy," Nadia said, though the words carried less heat than they had 3 days ago. "Yes, he did. And that was wrong." Theodore sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "But people aren't their worst mistakes, sweetheart. They're what they choose to do after making those mistakes." Nadia stared out the window at the coffee shop where Taylor was already settled with his morning routine. "What if I can't get past it? What if every time I look at him, I remember how it felt to discover that everything I thought I knew about him was a lie?" "Then you'll know that love isn't enough," Theodore said simply. "And that will be its own kind of answer." But even as she voiced her fears, Nadia knew that wasn't the real question haunting her. The real question was whether she was brave enough to try, whether she could choose the vulnerable path of forgiveness over the safer route of self-protection. Friday afternoon brought Charlotte O'Neill's deadline, and with it, a decision that could no longer be postponed. Nadia sat in the rare books section, surrounded by her mother's carefully curated collection, knowing that in a few hours she would have to call Charlotte with her answer. The practical choice was obvious. Accept the offer, save the store, sacrifice the soul of what made church books special. The emotional choice was impossible. Keep the collection, honor her mother's legacy, watch everything crumble for want of financial stability. She was still wrestling with the decision when the bell above the front door chimed, and she looked up to see Taylor entering carrying a leather portfolio and wearing an expression of quiet determination. "I know you asked for space," he said, approaching the rare books section with careful steps. "But I have something that might help with your deadline decision. Something that doesn't require you to forgive me or trust me or make any choices about us." "What do you mean?" Nadia asked, noting the formal way he was holding himself, as if this was a business meeting rather than a personal conversation. Taylor opened the portfolio and withdrew a stack of documents. "I've spent the last 3 days making phone calls, calling in favors, using every connection I have in the literary world." He set the papers on the table between them. "These are contracts for a series of literary events at church books, author readings, book club discussions, writing workshops. And this," he placed another document on top, "is a partnership agreement with the Regional Arts Council to make church books an official literary heritage site." Nadia stared at the papers, afraid to touch them. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that your store doesn't have to choose between financial survival and preserving its soul. These events will bring in enough revenue to cover your expenses while actually enhancing the rare books collection rather than destroying it." Taylor's voice was carefully professional, but she could hear the emotion underneath. "The heritage site designation comes with annual funding for preservation and community programming." "Why?" Nadia whispered, finally understanding the magnitude of what he was offering. "Why would you do this?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Taylor said simply. Because your mother's collection belongs here, serving the community she loved. Because church books is exactly what the literary world needs, a place where books are treasured, where readers are nurtured, where stories find their way to the people who need them most. Nadia looked up from the contracts to find Taylor watching her with an expression of quiet intensity. And because I love you, he added softly. Because even if you can never forgive me, even if we can never be together, I want you to have the choice to keep everything that matters to you. The offer was staggering in its generosity and its implications. Not only would it solve her immediate financial crisis, but it would establish church books as a permanent fixture in the literary landscape, ensuring its survival for generations to come. You don't have to decide about us, Taylor continued. This stands regardless of what happens between us. Your dreams, your store, your mother's legacy, they deserve to be protected. Nadia felt tears beginning to fall as the full weight of his gesture hit her. This wasn't manipulation or bargaining or an attempt to buy her forgiveness. This was simply love expressed through action, love that sought to heal and protect and nurture, even at the cost of the giver's own interests. Taylor, she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. There's one more thing, he said, his voice suddenly rough with emotion. Something I need you to see before you make any decisions about anything. 30 minutes later, Nadia found herself sitting in the passenger seat of Taylor's rental car, the contract safely stored behind the counter at Church Books and Danny left in charge of the store. They drove in companionable silence through the autumn landscape, leaving Millbrook behind for the winding country roads that led into the hills beyond town. Where are we going? Nadia asked as they turned onto a narrow gravel driveway lined with maple trees ablaze in red and gold. Home, Taylor said simply. My real home. The place where I first fell in love with words, where I learned that stories have the power to heal and transform and connect us to something larger than ourselves. The house that appeared at the end of the driveway was nothing like what Nadia had expected. It wasn't a mansion or a showplace of literary success. It was a modest two-story farmhouse with white clapboard siding and a wraparound porch, the kind of house that spoke of generations of quiet contentment rather than wealth or fame. My parents bought this place when I was 7, Taylor said as they climbed the porch steps. My father was a high school English teacher, my mother worked at the county library. They saved for 10 years to afford it. His voice caught slightly. They died the night after my first book tour appearance. Car accident on the way home from celebrating my success. Nadia's hand found his arm instinctively, offering comfort for a pain she was only beginning to understand. I've kept the house exactly as they left it, Taylor continued, unlocking the front door. I couldn't bring myself to change anything. It felt too much like erasing them. The interior of the house was warm and welcoming, filled with comfortable furniture and family photographs that showed a childhood rich in love if not in material wealth. But Taylor led her past the living room and kitchen to a small study at the back of the house that took Nadia's breath away. The room was lined floor to ceiling with books, not rare collectibles or impressive first editions, but well-loved volumes with cracked spines and marginal notes, books that had been read and reread and treasured. A simple wooden desk sat beneath a window that looked out over rolling fields, and scattered across its surface were handwritten manuscripts, notebooks filled with ideas, and family photographs that showed a young Taylor reading in this very room. This is where I wrote Echoes of Small Towns, Taylor said quietly. Sitting at my father's desk, surrounded by the books that shaped me, trying to capture the feeling of growing up in a place where everyone knows your story. Nadia moved slowly around the room, taking in the handwritten pages, the photographs, the physical evidence of the authentic roots that had produced the celebrated author. On the desk, she found a framed photo of a young Taylor with his parents, all three of them laughing as they built a snowman in the front yard. They never got to see me become successful, Taylor said, his voice thick with grief that had never fully healed. They died believing in me, but they never got to see if their belief was justified. Oh, Taylor, Nadia whispered, understanding flooding through her. Is that why you hide from your success? Because it feels like betrayal? Because it feels empty, Taylor corrected. Because all the recognition and awards and money in the world can't bring back the two people whose approval actually mattered. He picked up one of the handwritten pages from his first novel. I wrote this book to honor them, to tell the story of the place and people that made me who I am. But somewhere along the way, the book became more famous than the story it was trying to tell. Nadia watched as Taylor opened a desk drawer and withdrew another stack of handwritten pages, fresh ones, covered in his familiar script. What are these? What I've been working on for the past 3 days, Taylor said, handing her the pages. The most honest thing I've ever written. Nadia began to read, and immediately recognized her own story reflected back through Taylor's words. But this wasn't the romanticized version she might have feared, it was raw and real and achingly honest. He wrote about falling in love with a woman who saw books as living things, about the terror of realizing that fame had cut him off from authentic connection, about the choice between protecting himself and risking everything for love. You're writing about us, she said softly. I'm writing about coming home, Taylor corrected. About finding someone who sees past the celebrity to the person underneath. About learning that authenticity isn't about rejecting success, it's about staying connected to what matters most. As Nadia continued reading, she found herself in every paragraph, not as a character in someone else's story, but as the inspiration for Taylor's rediscovery of his own truth. The pages revealed a man who had lost himself in the pursuit of literary fame and found himself again through love. The last chapter isn't finished, Taylor said quietly. Because I don't know how the story ends. I don't know if the woman who taught me how to be real again can forgive the man who lied to her while learning that lesson. Nadia set the pages aside and turned to face him, seeing not the famous author or the mysterious stranger, but simply the man whose heart was spread across handwritten pages and childhood photographs. The man who had created literary opportunities for her store not as manipulation but as gift. The man who had brought her to his most sacred space not to impress her but to show her the authentic foundation of who he was. What if she can? Nadia asked softly. What if she understands that people make mistakes when they're afraid? What if she's learned that love isn't about perfect honesty from the beginning, it's about choosing honesty despite the cost? Taylor's eyes widened with hope and disbelief. Nadia. What if she's realized that falling in love with someone means accepting all of them, their light and their shadows, their courage and their fears, their truth and their mistakes? Nadia moved closer to where he stood beside his father's desk. What if she's discovered that forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened, it's about choosing love anyway? What are you saying? Taylor whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Instead of answering with words, Nadia reached up and cupped his face in her hands, feeling the slight tremor that ran through him at her touch. I'm saying that I love you, she said clearly. Not the famous author, not the mysterious stranger, not the perfect man who never makes mistakes. I love the man who writes love letters in the margins of his own books. I love the man who sits vigil across the street because he's afraid to push but refuses to give up. I love the man who honors his parents by staying connected to the truth of who they raised him to be. Taylor's hands came up to cover hers, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Even after everything I did wrong? Because of everything you did wrong, Nadia said with a smile that was both tender and fierce. Because making mistakes and learning from them and choosing to do better, that's what real love looks like. That's what real people do. I love you, Taylor whispered, leaning his forehead against hers. I love you so much it terrifies me. I love your brilliant mind and your generous heart and your absolute refusal to give up on the things that matter. I love the way you see magic in dusty old books and find beauty in broken things. Then show me, Nadia whispered back. Show me what it looks like when two imperfect people choose to build something real together. Taylor's lips found hers in a kiss that tasted of forgiveness and promise and the kind of love that transforms everything it touches. They held each other in the golden afternoon light streaming through the study windows, surrounded by the books and memories that had shaped them both, choosing love over fear, authenticity over perfection, the challenging beauty of real connection over the safer distance of self-protection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Taylor rested his forehead against hers. "What happens now?" "Now we go back to church books," Nadia said with a smile that lit up her entire face. "We call Charlotte and tell her the collection isn't for sale. We start planning literary events that will bring people from all over to experience the magic your parents would have loved. And we write the ending to your story together, not as author and subject, but as partners." "Partners," Taylor repeated, as if testing the word's weight and finding it perfect. "In literature and in love," Nadia confirmed. "In preserving the past and building the future. In staying true to who we are while becoming who we're meant to be together." As they prepared to leave the house where Taylor had first learned to love words, Nadia took one last look around the study that had produced one of her favorite novels. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For trusting me with this place, with your truth, with your heart." "Thank you," Taylor replied, "for teaching me that coming home isn't about returning to a place, it's about finding the person who makes you feel like your truest self." Hand in hand, they walked out of the house where Taylor had first discovered his voice and into the golden autumn afternoon that promised new beginnings. Behind them, the handwritten pages of his new novel waited on the desk, the ending still unwritten but the direction now clear. It would be a love story, of course. But more than that, it would be a story about two people who chose honesty over comfort, forgiveness over resentment, and love over the fear that had kept them both from being fully known. It would be a story about coming home to yourself by opening your heart to another. It would be, in every way that mattered, a true story. Chapter 8. 3 months later, on a February evening when snow fell softly outside the windows of church books, Nadia stood in the center of her transformed sanctuary and marveled at how completely her world had changed. The store buzzed with quiet activity as customers browsed the expanded poetry section, settled into reading nooks with cups of steaming coffee, and discussed their latest literary discoveries with the kind of passionate enthusiasm that Eleanor Church had always dreamed of inspiring. The literary events that Taylor had arranged had exceeded everyone's expectations. Church Books had hosted readings by celebrated authors, intimate book club discussions that drew participants from 3 counties, and writing workshops that had transformed aspiring storytellers into confident voices. The rare books collection remained intact and accessible, now complemented by a small museum display that told the story of 3 generations of church women who had built something extraordinary from their love of literature. "I still can't believe this is real sometimes," Nadia said to Taylor as they watched a group of teenagers participate in a poetry slam in the corner where they'd once shared stolen glances over Virginia Woolf essays. "Which part?" Taylor asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind as they stood near the front counter. "The fact that your store is thriving, or the fact that we're planning a wedding?" Nadia leaned back against his chest, admiring the simple engagement ring on her finger, not a showpiece, but a vintage Art Deco band that had belonged to his grandmother, chosen because it felt like a bridge between their family stories. "Both," she said with a laugh. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living in one of the romance novels I used to hide behind the counter when I was 16. "The best love stories," Professor Theodore observed from his reading chair near the front window, "are the ones that feel too beautiful to be true but are grounded in enough authentic emotion to be believed." Danny looked up from the new inventory he was cataloging. "Are you giving us literary criticism about your own daughter's love life, Professor Church?" "I'm giving you wisdom about the power of stories to transform reality," Theodore replied with the dignity of a man who had spent decades teaching young minds to appreciate the profound in the everyday. "And the power of reality to create stories worth telling." The evening's last customer had just left when Taylor produced a small remote control from behind the counter and pressed a button that made Nadia gasp with delight. Hundreds of tiny fairy lights sprang to life throughout the store, strung between the towering bookshelves and wound around the support pillars, transforming church books into something that looked like a scene from a fairy tale. "When did you do this?" Nadia asked, spinning slowly to take in the magical transformation. Danny and I have been working on it for weeks, Taylor admitted, as soft jazz music began playing from the store's sound system. I wanted to recreate our first almost kiss, but with better timing. And significantly fewer interruptions from protective fathers, Danny added with a grin. Professor Theodore chuckled as he gathered his evening reading materials. I think that's my cue to retire to my apartment upstairs and let you young people have your romantic moment. After Theodore and Danny had departed, Nadia and Taylor found themselves alone among the twinkling lights, surrounded by thousands of books that had witnessed the entire arc of their love story. The same shelves where they'd first felt that electric attraction now glowed with warm light, creating shadows and golden pools that made every corner feel intimate and enchanted. "Dance with me," Taylor said, extending his hand with the same careful courtesy he'd shown that first storm night when he'd been a mysterious stranger seeking shelter. "Here?" Nadia asked, though she was already accepting his invitation. "Where else?" Taylor pulled her into his arms, guiding her into a slow sway between the poetry stacks where they debated Virginia Woolf, past the rare book section where they discovered the truth about his identity, through the reading nook where they'd weathered storms both literal and emotional. "This is where we found each other. This is where we learned that love isn't about perfect beginnings, it's about choosing each other again and again, even when it's difficult." As they moved together to the gentle rhythm of the music, Nadia marveled at how perfectly they fit, not just physically, but emotionally, intellectually, spiritually. Taylor had kept his apartment in New York for work obligations, but his real home was here, in Millbrook, in the space they'd created together between the shelves of church books and the rooms above it where they were building a life. "I have something for you," Taylor said as the song came to an end, reaching into his jacket pocket. "If it's another contract for literary events, I'm going to start charging you rent for using my store as your office," Nadia teased. "Better," Taylor said, withdrawing a small leather-bound journal. "It's the first copy of my new book. The one I finished writing last week." Nadia accepted the journal with reverent hands, recognizing his handwriting on the cover, "Coming Home. A love story in margins and moments." "It's our story," Taylor explained, his voice soft with emotion. "From that first storm night to today. Every conversation, every revelation, every moment when we chose love over fear. I wanted to capture it all before the details faded, wanted to honor what we've built together." "You wrote about us?" Nadia asked, opening to a random page and finding herself described with such tenderness and precision that it took her breath away. "I wrote about coming home to yourself through love," Taylor corrected. "About finding someone who sees your truest self and chooses to love that person completely. About learning that authenticity isn't about being perfect, it's about being real." Nadia looked up from the pages to find Taylor watching her with the same intensity she remembered from their first meeting, but now tempered with the peace that came from being completely known and completely accepted. "What's the ending?" she asked. "That's up to us to write," Taylor replied, taking her hands in his. "Every day, every choice, every moment when we decide to keep choosing each other. The ending isn't something that happens to us, it's something we create together." As they stood in their transformed sanctuary, surrounded by books and fairy lights and the promise of all the stories yet to be written, Nadia understood that their love story was both complete and just beginning. They had found their way through deception to honesty, through hurt to healing, through fear to the kind of love that makes everything possible. "I love you," she said, the words carrying the weight of everything they'd overcome and everything they were choosing to build together. "I love you too," Taylor replied, his voice rich with gratitude and wonder. "Thank you for teaching me that home isn't a place you return to, it's a person you choose to become yourself with." 6 months later, Church Books hosted its first wedding ceremony, with Professor Theodore officiating and Danny serving as both best man and maid of honor because, as he explained to anyone who would listen, he'd been instrumental in their love story and deserved dual recognition. Lila created a stunning portrait of the couple exchanging vows among the bookshelves where they'd first fallen in love, and Charlotte O'Neill, who had become an unexpected ally after learning about the literary heritage designation, donated a rare collection of love poetry as a wedding gift. But even before their wedding day, Taylor and Nadia understood that they were already living their happily ever after. It wasn't a perfect fairy tale ending. They still disagreed about book categorization systems, Taylor still traveled for work obligations, and Nadia still worried about the store's long-term sustainability. But they faced these challenges together, as partners who had chosen radical honesty over comfortable deception, who had learned that real love was built on seeing and accepting each other completely. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the smallest lies, but they find their strength in the choice to tell the truth. Sometimes the person searching for your heart is standing right in front of you, and you have no idea until the moment when all pretenses fall away and you see each other clearly for the first time. Taylor and Nadia's story reminds us that authentic love isn't about finding someone perfect, it's about finding someone real. Someone who sees your flaws and chooses you anyway. Someone who challenges you to be better while loving you exactly as you are. Someone who understands that the most precious gift you can give another person is the truth of who you are, even when that truth is complicated and imperfect and sometimes painful. What's the most beautiful way someone has ever seen the real you? Or maybe you're still waiting for that person who truly sees your authentic self. Share your thoughts below. I love hearing about the moments when someone saw past the surface to find the treasure underneath. In a world that often encourages us to present polished versions of ourselves, church books became a sanctuary for authentic connection, the kind of place where people could be real, where stories mattered more than status, where love was measured not by grand gestures but by daily choices to see and honor each other's truth. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of passionate, authentic love. And don't forget to share this with someone who believes in the magic of unexpected connections. Tomorrow brings another story of hearts finding their way home to love. Thank you for being part of our Dear Love Diaries family, where every story reminds us that love always finds a way. Your comments and support make this community a place where hearts can believe in beautiful possibilities.